Okay. All right, welcome everyone to the 2021 New Orleans Poetry Festival. I'm Jonathan Pinton from the NOPF board. And before we get started, we wanted to thank our major sponsors that helped make the festival free and open to everyone this year. The New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival and the Academy of American Poets both gave us major grants and allowed us to keep everything free. Yeah, good to see you with this event. There's many more lined up for the rest of the month, and there's recordings of the one we've had so far. If you go to nolapoetry.com, that's N-O-L-A poetry.com, you'll see all kinds of events you can join, as well as recordings of all kinds of events. So please do check it out after we get out of here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over. JP, are you going to start? You should be able to unmute yourself.
There we go. Okay, good. Everybody can hear me, I assume. And yeah, welcome to the panel on transgressive Jewish poetics. A couple things to get out of the way. First, one, R.I.P. to Malcolm Cecil, who was a pioneer in synth music, not Jewish. Also, R.I.P. to Mums, great spoken word artist, not Jewish. And of course, DMX, not Jewish. But I just wanted to get my, my thanks and RIPs out there to those three. Then after that, I do want to say, Jack Greha can't be here with us, but I definitely want to give a shout out to them and their work. Greater Grave is a really, really good book. We've done several panels together. They're going through a lot right now and can't be here with us, but I just want to say that some of the ideas here were myself and them discussing what we were going to be talking about. So they're, spirits over this kind of panel a little bit, and just want to acknowledge them. Okay, and now I'm going to just do a quick announcement of the people that are in this with me, and then I'll do my thing, my spiel, and we'll get it moving. Okay, so I'm gonna go first, but after me will be Rax King. A lot of people already know Rax King. Rax King's been doing a lot of work recently, has a new book out, which they will tell you about. Then it'll be Jesse Ashkenazi, who does the Crimson Coyote podcast, and they can tell you a little bit more about that if they feel so. And then it will be Hannah Cohen, who will help guide the Q&A and discussion. And Hannah Cohen has a lovely chat book out also, maybe from last year or a couple years ago now, maybe even 3 years ago. Yeah. Yeah. And they can tell you about what they're working on right now. And now I'm going to move into my thing. So one of the things I tend to do at these on these panels is I tend to go with a David Antin style talk. David Antin believed that he would be able to talk a poem to you. I would never talk a poem to anyone. I would talk an anti-poem to you at best. But I did like his idea of kind of removing the musicality out of the poem and decided to just have a discussion with you. The talk poem actually reminds me a lot of what I was talking about before we got in this, about speaking, thinking, and the idea of just saying things that are on your mind to get to a point of figuring out what a concept really is, what an idea really is, what a philosophy can really be. And if anybody's spent time with David Antin's lectures, which have been transcribed, that is exactly what he's doing. So I tend to do a bit of that too. And there's going to be a lot of roundabout kind of stuff, so that's point A, that's point B, and I don't know how we got from one to the other. That's my move. And anybody who's read my work will know that is my move. I believe in disjoint. Okay, David Antin also is a good Jewish writer. And he actually was good friends with the guy I was hanging out with earlier today, and that's Douglas Rothschild, another Jewish writer from New York City. And I'm only going to bring him up very quickly because we were talking about Jewish poetics earlier, and I'm going to really expand the idea of what poetics is. There's a reason I use poetics and I didn't say Jewish poetry. What I want to get into when it comes to the poetics is thinking kind of Aristotelian about it, and therefore we would be bringing in a sense of drama, right? It seems insane to really discuss Jewish writing without bringing in theater and performance, considering and in America especially, that's how a lot of Jewish people got their names out there, was doing theater, playwriting, and over time, obviously stand-up comedy, right? So we were discussing how at one point in comedy specifically, if you weren't a Jewish comedian, you use a lot of Jewish moves, let's say. There were definitely like people sprinkling in Yiddish just to sprinkle it in there, obviously using accents, sometimes fucked up ways, but at the heart of a lot of American theater and American comedy are Jewish folks. Now, what Nada Gordon asked about earlier on Instagram was, what are Jewish poetics? And my belief is, and his belief is anybody writing anything Jewish is adding to Jewish poetics, right? And the reason I really feel like that is because as somebody of color, right? It'd be really fucked up if someone's like, that poem's not Black enough, right? That poem's not Puerto Rican enough. That poem's not queer enough. So I think it's foolish to act like a poem isn't, or any piece of writing is not Jewish enough, right? And as I'll get into, actually, fuck it, I'll just jump right over there. There's a discussion of who is and who isn't Jewish. Judah Friedlander, the comedian, talked about this in his Netflix special, which is, some Jewish people are very, very specific about who they decide who can be Jewish, right? Matrilineal line. And then, of course, obviously, fuck it, I might as well just say his name. You almost can't do this discussion. Like, I can't do a Black discussion without slavery. We can't do a Jewish discussion without Holocaust. So Hitler, quarter, right? So that's where I fall, right? And I think that it's interesting for some people to say some people aren't Jewish that are only a quarter and other people are. One thing I will say to this point is, oftentimes when someone says they're Jewish of any amount, that statement is not forgotten by people, and it does have ways of coming back. Oftentimes, if you're watching the QAnon thing, Fred there talked about Ron and Jim Watkins also bring up his Jewishness when it was convenient to be anti-Semitic towards him. And I think that happens a lot with people, whether they're half Jewish, quarter Jewish, full Jewish. Once somebody knows you are Jewish, that those things do tend to come back. Like, I've certainly heard a bunch of jokes where it's like, it's just a joke. And, it's just there, is all I'm saying. So what I will say is that I believe that we can work from whatever definition you want to work from, but I certainly ascribe to, however you want to define yourself as a Jewish person makes you a Jewish person. Whatever you're writing adds to that poetics. And to put a final note on that is, I will say this much. If I'm not Jewish enough for you, I will say I've seen a lot of people talking about Black writing who aren't Black at fucking all, and have added nothing to the goddamn discussion on Black writing. So there we go on that one. Now to get really into Jewish poetics and the transgressive nature of the poetics, I'm going to begin by saying, yes, Mary Shelley started science fiction, right? No doubt fucking about it. But the term science fiction does come from a Jewish writer, and some of the people who put a finer note on science fiction were Isaac Asimov, who's a Jewish writer, and like many other Jewish people over time, including, as we were talking about earlier, Lou Reed, they're not really that connected to the religion. So I think there's maybe a split also between Jewish writing and Judaic writing, as Grace Paley was joking about in one of her stories. And there's another guy, Furman, who's mentioned in Elon Stavris's book on how Yiddish affected America, is that maybe the people of the book should be called the people of the books, and that it's more about texts and what you're reading and how you maybe think, read, understand yourself into a culture more so than how you deal with the actual religion. And I think that comes out in a lot of science fiction that is written by Jewish people that maybe don't speak to Judaism, but there is a lot going on with cultural aspects. Obviously, Isaac Asimov running with the robots kind of thing. As I said to Hannah earlier, he's putting down rules for how this golem's going to work, how the new golem's going to work. Diaspora is fucking huge in Jewish science fiction, and I would be remiss not to bring up my homeboy, and that would be Superman. He's not my favorite fucking hero, all right? But he was created by Siegel and Schuster, and it was a very transgressive move on their part to create this guy who was extremely powerful, could take down both gangsters and criminals, but it could also take down businessmen who weren't doing the right thing, could take down politicians who weren't doing the right thing, you know? And it's also a great immigrant story too. You know, it comes from another place, but what makes it a really, really good immigrant story is the reason that the red sun was his weakness was that when the skies would be filled with dust across Kansas during the Dust Bowl, it made the sky red and it killed all the, you know, obviously Dust Bowl killed all the plants. That's why that was Superman's weakness. They wanted to tie him very much into the American land. I will also say this, that if Superman's a boring character, I think it's because Gentiles haven't known how to write him properly. I think that they haven't understood that he doesn't need redemption in the same way. I think they haven't understood this other great thing. They always want to make Superman a god. And there's a small parable about what's the one question that God never asked? And that question is, why me? Superman has asked, why me? But he's also asked the more important question, because you always answer a question with a question. And that question would be, why not me? And that's a very, very Jewish question, is to say, if I'm here and I have to do all these good deeds over and over again, right? Like Superman's all about the mitzvah, basically, right? Then why not him? Why shouldn't he be doing these things? All right, so that's kind of me and science fiction a bit. I'm looking at my time. I'll give you a couple more minutes to leave room, but I also wouldn't feel right coming here and not discussing my boyfriend Proust. But I'm going to do this very, very quickly, in that if Leo Rostin has said that Proust is a yenta, Kafka likes to kvetch, Martin Buber loves to cavell, I write some nebbish characters, Spinoza's a bit of a nubnik, and I think that's all I'll do for Yish. Oh, and Woody Allen's a fucking schmuck. And then I'm going to read Delmore Schwartz just very, very quickly, because Delmore Schwartz was a big influence on Lou Reed. So for as not Jewish as he says he is in terms of the religion, he is connected to a Jewish poetic tradition. And I'm just going to read this from Delmore Schwartz. One thing I really like about Delmore Schwartz, that along with Sholem Ash and Sholem Aleichem, he's definitely a very urban writer. And I could get into more urban writing with Jewish people, because Walter Mosley is also a Jewish writer, a Black Jewish writer. And obviously he made his bones in fucking urban writing. And I have a real thing about the city for Jewish people and that. But anyway, so I'm going to read this real quick from Delmore Schwartz, and then I'm going to move it ahead to let everybody do what they want to do. I'm just going to jump ahead. So then I looked up at the infinite sky, star pointing and silent, and it was then on that evening that I became a man. That evening was my manhood's birthday. I went then to Egypt, the greatest of nations. There I encountered the pharaoh who built the tombs, great public buildings, many theaters and seashore villas. And my wife's beauty was such that, fearing his power and lust, I called her my sister, a girl neither for him nor for me. And I'm going to jump ahead in this a little bit. I just want to lay out that this writer was definitely going directly into the imagery that we expect from a lot of Jewish writers. And I wanted to put that out there. And then here's where I really want to go, which is, sorry, there we go. The angel said to me, why are you laughing? Laughing, not me. Who was laughing? I did not laugh. It was a cough. I was coughing. Only hyenas laugh. It was a cold I caught 9 months after Abraham married me, when I saw how I was slender and beautiful, more and more slender and beautiful. And it's that I appreciate the laughter of this. Oh, I do not wish to hear a joke, a big joke, but the joke is always just on me. So there's a bit of a schlemiel and schlemazel from Delmore Schwartz. But again, I think that we couldn't do what we're doing without a lot of the humor and that comedic element that keeps coming out. That happens with Kafka, and it happens throughout the diaspora, whether in America, the Czech Republic, France, et cetera, et cetera. And now up next will be Rax.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Thank you for introducing me and for having me, and for, I think every time I've seen you now, JP, you've talked about Superman in just the most beautiful way. I'd like never spent 30 seconds of my life thinking about Superman before, and at this point, so many seconds, so many. And that notwithstanding, I'm also really glad that you brought up comedy and its importance in the Jewish rhetoric, because actually, let me preemptively apologize, because there's like 3 people having parties on my block, and I live on just the noisiest fucking street in Brooklyn, and you're gonna be hearing like bachata and ambulances, and there is nothing I can do about that but just appreciate it, the sounds of the city. Anyway, so I had a whole thing prepared about Yiddish revolutionary songs and the Bund, the Jewish Labor Bund. And then I reread just this beautiful collection of stories. And wouldn't you know it, now I have decided that I want to talk about Tevye instead. Probably the most famous character in all of Jewish creation, I would argue. Known to most people by means of Fiddler on the Roof, but not invented in the musical Fiddler on the Roof by any stretch. Tevye is a creation of the Yiddish-speaking writer Sholem Aleichem, whom JP also referred to. And Sholem Aleichem is probably the most prominent Jewish novelist, like of all time, or not Jewish, Yiddish novelist of all time. One of very few writers to deliberately seek out and write in Yiddish at a time when most of his contemporaries were writing in Russian or Hebrew. And at the time, Yiddish was the vernacular language of Eastern European Jewish people. And so to write literary prose in the Jewish vernacular tongue was, to my mind, an inherently transgressive move, just the same way that it would have been an inherently transgressive thing for Chaucer to produce great works of literature in Middle English, and everyone was still speaking, French at the time, or for Mozart to produce operas in German when, at the time that he was composing, serious operas were all in Italian. But Yiddish is a little bit different, I think, because if you look at the way that it's used, particularly by Americans, including some American Jews, people don't often speak it. They'll sprinkle the occasional Yiddish word into their speech to spice things up. And Yiddish, for most people who are aware of it, is not so much a language as something to be pillaged here and there for words and phrases, and particularly little profanities that make the speaker sound more urbane and witty. And it, to me, as someone who is attempting to learn to speak Yiddish and to write in it and to treat it like a serious language, it's a little bit frustrating, but also speaks exactly to the way that Sholem Aleichem sought out Yiddish, and speaks to what I want to talk about tonight, which is, what is it about speaking in a vernacular tongue, especially such an inherently idiomatic and informal vernacular tongue, that carries with it some seed of revolutionary potential? What is it about speaking to the peasants in their own words, with their own tone, that is so transgressive by its nature? And so now I'm going to pull up a thing and I'm going to read a little bit. The character of Tevye, very, very different, incidentally, from the stories that comprise Tevye the Dairyman to the musical Fiddler on the Roof, which was first produced in, I believe, 1964, right at the height of the Reform Judaism movement, right? Like right post-Holocaust, post-Tikkun Olam, like you're developing this new class of secular Jew, but also apolitical Jew. We've learned our lesson, right? We don't want to make waves anymore at this point. And so what we do is we take this incredible character, Tevye, this incredibly effective piece of satire of a Jew for Jews, and we completely neuter him. And one of the things I think that we do to neuter him is to make him illiterate. In the stories, Tevye can read and write, which, if you think about it, makes perfect sense, because with obvious exceptions, most pointedly women for much of Jewish history have not been supposed to learn to read and write. But I mean, by and large, it's a mandate to learn to read and write, because it's a mandate to be able to study the Torah and to interpret it. And you can't do that if you can't read and write. And so it makes perfect sense when you think about it that Tevye would be able to read and write. Oops, someone muted me. So what is accomplished by taking this character who is written on the page as literate and stripping away his ability to read and write? I think that you, completely disengage the comedy of the stories in Tevye the Dairyman. And I'm going to pull up a little quote that I have here. So we all know the song If I Were a Rich Man, right, from Fiddler on the Roof. And it is loosely based in this passage here. Having sold everything and thrown some hay to my horse, I decided to take a stroll around town. As it is said, man is but dust, a man is only human. I wanted to see a bit of the world, breathe the air, and look at the fine goods that the town Yehupetz displays in its shop windows, which seem to say, look with your eyes as much as you like, but to touch, don't dare. Standing just like that at a large shop window with a pocket full of coins and ruble notes, I thought, God in heaven, if I had a tenth of what I see here, I would never complain to God again. I'd make a match for my eldest daughter and give her a good dowry, besides wedding presents, a wardrobe, and wedding expenses. I'd sell the horse and wagon and the little cows and move right into town, buy a seat by the eastern wall of the shul. I'd get pearls for my wife, long may she live, and distribute charity like the biggest property owner. I'd see to it that the house of study had a metal roof, not a roof about to collapse any minute. I'd open a religious school in town and a hospital and a shelter like in the other respectable cities, so poor people wouldn't have to lie around on the bare floor of the house of study. In this passage, Tevye is daydreaming the way he does in the musical about how much better life could be if he were wealthy, but he's doing so in an intensely poetic way, and also with this outward urge to spread any wealth that he gets around to the other people in the town, which is not something that's repeated in the song. The whole musical, Fiddler on the Roof, is intensely about Tevye and his individual struggles. And then in the back half, you know, there are these pogroms and his family is forced out of Anatevka, which happens in the book as well. But we don't really see him in the musical as part of any community so much. And in the book, he is very much part of the community. He's completely literate, if not poetic, right? And he's witty and he's funny, and he uses his education to throw barbs at the Russian townspeople who torment him because they are not as educated as him. He can kind of pull one over on them that way with great regularity. This kind of brings me, and I know I only have about a minute left, and I'm going to sum up really fast. To my mind, the comedic darkness of the Tevye the Dairyman stories, this represents almost precisely the same urge as the urge towards poetry. It's a rhetorical urge. You want to manipulate language to, in the case of many moments in Tevye the Dairyman, manipulating language to get the better of people who are otherwise seen as superior to him. manipulating language in the form of these mistranslations that he's always doing from Torah, and mistranslations, incidentally, which are repeated in the musical, but in the book he's doing it on purpose, like mischievously. In the musical, we're given to believe he just doesn't know what he's talking about because he's too poor to know how to read. In the musical, he's presented as this totally virtuous figure, stripped of any real comedy. In the books, he's a figure of great personal agency and even some deviance. And there's something, I believe, poetically rhetorical in the way that he seeks to meet various ends and to make things happen in his life. In the musical, things are inflicted on him. In the stories, he inflicts as much as anything is inflicted on him. He's not this perfectly virtuous character. And I think that that makes a big difference in just how we see Jewish creation and literature rhetorically. I think that in the book, the comedy and the tragedy, the intense sadness, it's all bundled up together in a way that is much more effective than the musical, which I have to say is still one of my favorite musicals of all time. I love Fiddler on the Roof forever, but it's schmaltzy, you know, it's deliberately schmaltzy because it is not speaking to Jews. It is speaking to non-Jews who maybe have a lot of guilt about the way that they've treated Jews as an alien body. The musical is Tikkun Olam personified. The book is a much more masterful piece of rhetoric, and that's my thing. And I'm going to turn it on over to the next person now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, both of you guys. That was incredible and you're brilliant. And thank you so much for sharing. I want to first thank you for inviting me here. My name is Jessie Ashkenazi. So, you know, there's a little bit of Jewish there, but ironically, even though my last name is Ashkenazi, my father's family actually are, well, my grandfather, he was a Romanite Jew. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about that history and some of the things that I believe contribute to my own personal poetics as a Jewish woman, and probably also for some other Jewish people as well. But so as I mentioned, my grandfather was a Romanite Jew, and I've been learning a little bit more and researching more about that history. And that was an ethnic Jewish community that was native to the Eastern Mediterranean. And they were basically almost completely exterminated during the Holocaust. There's about 50 Romanite Jews remaining in Ioannina, Greece, which is where they come from today. There's only one Romanite temple in the US, and that's on the Lower East Side. And so Ioannina was a small city in northwestern Greece near the Albanian border. And due to its location west of the Pindos mountain range, the community was isolated geographically from mainstream Judaism, even within Greece. So I like to think of that being transgressive in itself and their practices. The community had to develop their own traditions and customs, minhag, which is their prayer rites, and they remained Greek speaking even after most other Jewish communities in Greece were absorbed into traditional Sephardic. Now, my grandmother was Sephardic and she knew how to speak Spanish, but that was never really shared with us. So I'm going to bring up something a little bit more about that later. But basically, something that I've been thinking about in my writing is that Ashkenazi Jews are sort of the poster children for Judaism in America, or the way that they're portrayed. But that kind of dismisses all but one central branch of Judaism, and it discards a lot of diverse customs and histories. So that's been important to me. Specifically, something that Romanite Jews practice was liturgy. And so they would write a piet, or which is a Jewish liturgical poem, and it was meant to be sung and chanted and performed during religious services, and they were these sacred songs. So pietim have been written since the very earliest days, and the word is derived from the Greek term for poetry. So I kind of like to think that there's something that has been passed down in me, because I've been writing poetry for as long as I can remember. And it always felt like I was channeling it from somewhere, and I didn't quite know where it was coming from. And in this way, sort of feel like there is a DNA component, which I also like to explore in my poetry work. DNA, cells, lineage, ancestry, things that are passed down, especially like the women. So I also had a bat mitzvah, and I also feel that a bat mitzvah is a very unique experience because it's a poetry performance that's distinctive within a synagogue. It's, as Kenning mentioned, there's elements of music and theater, and there are always comedic anecdotes. And I believe that that process also is, in terms of Jewish poetics, it forces us to ask questions, which is what we're all doing when we're writing poetry until it stops itching. And it encourages us to be scholarly. Something else that I have been writing about a lot recently, which is why I think Kenning actually invited me here, is the unique experience of the intersection of being white and Jewish. It's very complex, and this is a complex thing to talk about. But on the one hand, there is the experience of white privilege. Certainly, we experience white privilege in ways that other races and ethnic groups don't have access to. But at the same time, it's a strange thing to be grouped in with the same people who have historically oppressed and attempted to ethnically cleanse your ancestors. So I think about this distinction a lot, and the feeling of not really having a place within maybe either group. And I think that that's really inherent to a lot of poets from all different backgrounds. The sort of complicated status of Judaism as a religion, Jewishness as ethnic identity. I think for most of us that our presidential administration that regularly promoted white supremacy has been making us think a lot about our Jewishness. And it's been a difficult thing to see people storming the Capitol with Nazi symbols and the young men in Charlottesville screaming, "Jews will not replace us." I've had to reflect on a lot of that, because just thinking about whiteness and it's a very strange place. I think that's very unique to Jews. And that has affected, I think, representation for me. Physical appearance has been something I've grappled with since I was little. I think Jewish women and from many other ethnicities and races are taught that their physical features are less beautiful, perhaps, than like Anglo whites. And as a Mediterranean Jew, especially with dark features, I always had some shame and complex thoughts about the way that I look. And that has to do with media messaging and stereotyping. But for as long as I can remember, people have asked me, "Where are you from? Why do you look like this? What do you," it's just constant like trying to figure out what I am. And I think that also influenced my own poetry in trying to explore just where to fit. And I also think there's a lot of negative connotation, and I've been writing about this lately too, about how we're typecast. Like, for example, I studied theater and I was always cast as a villain woman. And that's fun. Like, villains are super fun and interesting, but sometimes I might just like want to, maybe why can't I be the ingenue? Like, why do I always have to be a devilish woman? And with men in my life too, I believe I've been very objectified for these reasons, is thought of as a vixen or like this fetishization. And I believe that has impacted this sort of outsider perspective that most people who write poetry have. And because of that, it made it more compelling for me to write in code the way that I do, focusing really heavily on unique images, sound, word choices, and the senses. And I think there's an absurdist, surrealist quality within my poetry. I think absurdism and surrealism are very similar on different points of the spectrum. But the work that I write is really straightforward and it rejects formalism. And I think that everything that I just kind of mentioned informs that experience. There's also, just checking the time really quick here. how am I doing? Okay, so another thing that I think about in terms of Jewish poetics is traumatic storytelling. And again, what we pass down through generations. So I wrote something down that really resonated with me, which is the poet Aaron Samuels said, "As a Jew, I learned first that the world was not a safe place. A Jewish poem, mine or otherwise, perhaps understands this realization innately, settling its world making on the unstable bedrock of cultural trauma." And I thought that's really beautiful, and absolutely, I think what I've been trying to get at a little bit. I remember, you know, we all have, I think as Jewish people, our experience of when we first learn about the Holocaust. And I was very young and I was in Hebrew school and they made us watch a movie on it. And I just, you know, of course, I just remember more than anything feeling completely confused. And I think reality shifted for me at that point. But I do think that sharing traumatic stories and histories is a part of Jewish storytelling, kind of like a folk song. And perhaps our history of displacement also informs our approaches of fragmentation and our avoidance of kind of coherent narratives. And one aspect of that I find particularly interesting is there's the act of deciding what words are the most important to share or what words we want to conceal or withhold when we write poems. And I think that storytelling in Jewish families is a lot like that. When we think of ancestors who told the stories of the Holocaust to their, you know, the younger generations that came after them, what they wanted to share, what they wanted to conceal, what was most important for people to know. And I feel that that is a really strong aspect of Jewish poetics. And the final thing that I kind of wanted to contribute to this discussion is when I write poetry, and I'm sure many others who do, I kind of view it as a sort of an occult practice. And I feel like there's a lot of interesting pagan and Jewish parallels. There's the spiritual experiences found in holy lands and our use of symbols. We even use anointing oils. We both have sacred texts with hidden meanings and these oral traditions. And in both Jewish mysticism and in some forms of European paganism, the letters and the symbols of the sacred language are seen as possessing like magical divine powers. The Kabbalistic view of magical powers within Hebrew letters, and the Norse pagans find magical, powers in the runes. Jewish communities in Eastern European were often segregated from Christian society, as were pagans. There's also a sacredness of nature in both of these religions, and like the Jewish festival of Sukkot, which is like an agricultural festival, celebrates the fertility of the earth. The Old Testament and the Kabbalah use trees as sacred symbols, and paganism obviously involves the harmony of nature and the connection to the earth. There are symbols of angels and divine beings. Kabbalah has a Shekinah, I'm not totally sure I'm pronouncing that right, but it's like a female personification that looks like a goddess, similar to the triple goddess in paganism. So I find all of that really fascinating, because I do feel like we often channel these different things from different kind of esoteric planes when we write. So I thought that it was interesting to view it both through that lens. And I was just going to maybe share a quick poem that I wrote. I've been kind of thinking about these themes. So this is called Miss Provence. And it's about the French beauty model that basically, when she announced that she was part Jewish, she was completely flooded with anti-Semitic tweets online. So it's really short, and it's just talking about, again, those sort of beauty standards with Judaism, and also this idea that Jews had a distinct smell. So it goes, "A man in the corner shouts, 'Your ears look like bass clefs.' He says I've gone outside the lines, so he won't share his lingonberries with me. I excuse myself, pay the bathroom attendant who calls security on my perfume. At home, I order blonde hair, tape it all over my body." So I just wanted to share a little personal poem with you all. And thank you so much for letting me share this with you. And I also want to just kind of dedicate this to my Jewish grandmother, Marilyn Schumann, who just passed away a few days ago. So thank you so much.
I think it's really kind of, it's all coming together. What I'm going to be kind of briefly discussing, because I'm also going to be managing the Q&A later, is kind of this capstone on everything that Kenny and Rax and Jesse have talked about, which is this idea of what are we taking and what are we giving away when it comes to Judaism. So I'll preface this. Have you ever been reading something? Let's say you're reading a book about a Jewish character, or let's say if there's a horror book that has 7 children in it and they all have to fight this creepy clown monster, right? And one of those characters is Jewish, right? Imagine reading this book and the first chapter in which this character is kind of introduced not only is spoken through a very indirect way, but drops multiple slurs for Jewish people. And you're kind of left wondering, well, gee, everyone else in these other kid characters kind of have like this internal drama and dialogue. Why does this feel so off? And of course, I'm referring to Stephen King's It, by featuring the lone Jewish character Stanley Uris. And this kind of set off this whole chain of, we've been talking about like what Jewish writers bring to the table, more or less, whether it's Rax talking about how Tevye kind of becomes different in a different medium because of the musical, as well as taking away kind of his inherent Yiddishness, so to speak, and neutering him. We've talked about with Jesse about beauty standards and what different, even within Judaism, it's not just a monolith. And with Kenny, we've talked about philosophy and what exactly is Jewish performance. And I kind of just wanted to discuss moments where what's the line? Who can write about Jewish culture? Who can write about Judaism? Who can tell these stories? And of course, as mentioned before, the Holocaust is a very it's the elephant in the room. I think it informs so many people's works, whether or not you were personally or your family is affected by the Holocaust or Shoah. But getting back to Stephen King, how do I feel when someone who does not identify as Jewish, or to my knowledge is not Jewish, creates these sort of characters, and even in poems? And of course, one of my personal favorite poets, Sylvia Plath, uses this imagery in especially her 2 most famous poems, Daddy and Lady Lazarus. How do we, as people who identify as Jews, whether we converted or matrilineal, patrilineal, I don't fucking care. Like, technically, I'm not Jewish in matrilineal standards, but you know what? I don't fucking give a shit because I'm Jewish. So take that, Uncle Mark. Like, but how do we approach these writers and these poems and these books when they are taking bits and pieces of Jewish culture that are often very, traumatic or stressful? I mean, I've been called slurs. I live in a city that's largely Christian, has one of the world's largest Christian universities. Y'all know who I'm talking about. So, I've experienced that. I've experienced anti-Semitism both in person and online. So how do we, when we read these things, how does that make us feel? And to me, with the case of Stephen King and Stanley Uris, I didn't appreciate that the one Jewish character didn't get his own internal monologue, really. A lot of his backstory is told through the other characters. And he even, ends his life by suicide, which is kind of seen like as a spit in the face by other characters, because he's not the only character that dies, but he is the one that only takes his life. And I think it shows that there's a very weird misunderstanding of when Gentile writers, or writers who are not knowledgeable about Judaism or Jewish culture, make these characters and then, you know, they just kind of chuck them away. Or when they appropriate things like the Golem or the Dybbuk. I am thinking about the X-Files episode, I think in season 4 with Kaddish, where I actually like parts of the episode, but at the same time, in that classic Chris Carter fashion, skip it every time. Yeah, it almost gets to there. It's like, oh yeah, you know, white nationalists. And I think honestly, if it didn't have the supernatural element, it would have worked as this better episode. But then they had to like make the Golem from the, you know, the bride's dead, you know, to-be husband. And it's just kind of like, really, you know, when we think about what Jewish writers bring when they write their own Jewish characters, and again, this isn't a monolith. There are plenty of writers who identify or grew up Jewish that aren't good at it, but they, you know, that's a different conversation. But when we talk about like Gentiles and Goyim and, you know, non-Jews taking these stories, and even with the best intentions and not quite executing it, which is why I want to get back to Sylvia Plath. Most people, most poets, especially I think contemporary poets, you know, we all kind of had our first moment of reading Sylvia Plath's poems as, you know, we're in this weird post-confessional poetry experimental kind of phase now, where there's not quite a label, but many of us, especially young female poets or, you know, identifying poets, kind of found a comfort in Sylvia. And, you know, we read poems like Daddy and Mad Girl's Love Song and Lady Lazarus. And it didn't, even though I was Jewish, it didn't occur to me. I was like, oh, bright as a Nazi lampshade. Okay, you know, hair doctor, hair god, you know, bringing in all these, you know, bringing all these images of the Holocaust, especially, and considering the time period she was writing in as well, in the late 50s, early 60s. It wasn't that long ago after the Holocaust had occurred, and she's not Jewish. Does that mean, yes, said Bitch Caucus, does that mean that people who are not Jewish can't ever write poems or stories about Jewish culture? Yeah, exactly. I actually for a moment thought she was Jewish as well. So I wanted to quickly kind of bring up, so I'm just going to read a little bit of Lady Lazarus, because there are some moments where I'm just like, so, Herr Doctor, so, Herr Enemy, I am your opus, I am your valuable, the pure gold baby that melts to a shriek. I turn and burn. Do not think I underestimate your great concern. Ash, ash, you poke and stir. Flesh, bone, there is nothing there. A cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling. Herr God, Herr Lucifer, beware, beware. Very Holocausty right there, you know? And it, when we think about Sylvia Plath, when we think about her poems that often deal with suicidal ideation and depression and, you know, kind of a violence of the self and the violence of family and, you know, her father dying, at what point is it okay to appropriate this genocide, this history of a genocide, you know, gold fillings, of course, taken from, you know, Jewish victims and, you know, the Holocaust had several other ethnic groups and people and communists that were killed, but specifically gold fillings and soap and shoes. And when you appropriate those specific items of violence that were perpetrated against a group of, you know, a religious group or an ethnic group, so to speak, it undermines that poem. It undermines Sylvia's confession of this ongoing internal violence. And the older I get, and I'm sure many of you may feel this way as well, the older I get, the more I'm like, I don't think that's okay. You know, you can still appreciate Sylvia's work. You can still appreciate Stephen King, even if he keeps making stupid Twitter takes online. And I'm just like, bro, shut up. But as we learn more and more about writers that identify as Jewish, yes, exactly, identify as Jewish, or, you know, finding out that Lou Reed was Jewish, or like all these other writers, even if they don't explicitly state it, why are we focusing so much attention on the artistry of Sylvia Plath's, daddy or Lady Lazarus, when there's, Emma Lazarus, when there's other Jewish writers that can kind of approach these topics with the sensitivity and nature. And as an aside, there's a way to reclaim that sort of character. With Stephen King's Stan Uris, I wrote a poem for him and kind of going into kind of the experience of anti-Semitism and these kind of slurs and how it made me feel reading that chapter where the word, and trigger warning, kike is mentioned 6 times. And I know that for a number because I counted it, and there's other mentions. So apologies if I rambled a little bit, but my point being is that when writers who are not Jewish or do not identify as Jewish to the knowledge of the audience, writing those stories, writing those poems, taking those events specifically and trying to attribute it to a different type of context or violence, it not only lessens the original intent, but it also takes away kind of that spotlight and kind of that understanding, especially when if non-Jews, and largely a lot of people who read Sylvia Plath, like if they aren't Jewish or don't really know that much about Holocaust, they read, Lady Lazarus and like, oh, this is cool, Herr God, Herr Lucifer, but at the same time, it can be damaging. And as we learn more and more about Jewish literature and how we read these texts, at the end of the day, what does it mean for us as writers, as people who are trying to work within, languages that most people don't speak regularly or even read regularly? What does it mean when other writers borrow that? And again, I'm not trying to gatekeep certain aspects, but when you read another Holocaust novel that isn't even accurate, like the Tattooist of Auschwitz or whatever, or like, the Boy in the Striped Pajamas, when you make this sort of like torture porn for consumption, and when you take these terms and use them for a different purpose, it's just not a winning combination, and it only lessens our, I guess, prominence in that. So yeah, I hope that made sense. I'm trying to work these things out. I have a lot of feelings about Sylvia Plath, and again, there isn't anything inherently wrong with her, to my knowledge. But at the end of the day, I'm like, really, you named your character Esther Greenwood. You're going to open up a novel with, the Rosenbergs being executed. Like, come on, like, really. So, there's a larger discussion to be had about cultural appropriation. And this isn't even to mention that, like, this is largely, I'm speaking from a white Jewish experience. What does it mean for Jews who converted? What does it mean for Ethiopian Jews or Jews who are, Asian or queer or trans? And, but, at the end of the day, there needs to be more representation in literature and in media that isn't just the kind of like what Jesse said, isn't just the Ashkenazi poster child, that isn't just this flat, one-dimensional character of like Stanley Uris, who even gets a bar mitzvah in the movie, but then it's like really never touched upon. And then even in the book, it's like, yeah, he just offed himself. So like, yeah, he did it on purpose, So yeah, I think I kind of, again, when we deal with transgressions and we deal with like things that are dividing and taking away, I think we also have to acknowledge what is being taken from us and how we can either review these moments of literature and media and reclaim them back for ourselves. So yeah, I think that's about it. I tend to be pretty short with these things, so I'm happy to kind of lead into the Q&A if everyone is pretty cool about that. Yeah, I just I'm super excited to be on this panel, and huge shout out to Rex and Jesse and Kenny and everybody. I can't wait for this to be in person someday. So, but yeah. So I guess if you feel comfortable just typing the chat a question or like direct messaging someone if you don't feel comfortable. Yeah. I'm still hung up on it too. Yeah. But you're welcome. I don't know if Jonathan, if what the past has been for Q&A kind of moderating. So I'm pretty cool with whatever.
we seem okay. If you want me to allow people to unmute themselves, it's up to you.
Yeah, sure. If you have a question for anybody across the panel or for one person, just, make yourself.
Hannah, you got muted somehow.
That's weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome to either enter it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask any of us directly. So, yeah. We can also ramble a little bit more. We can trade babka recipes or something.
I have a question.
Hi.
This is for Rax. On this whole topic of the difference between Fiddler and Tevye the Dairyman, like what are your thoughts on how the Yiddish production of Fiddler has come to play in that? Like, has it helped or hurt in the idea of like Tevye being deconstructed and made into like a more two-dimensional character? Because I've always been very fascinated with that production, and that like using Yiddish alone seems to create this very different effect of sort of placing you right in the period. But I also am not so sure that it really makes it any more authentic in reality.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I should preface my response to it by saying that I did not get a chance to see the Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof. I'm gonna be kicking myself for it the rest of my life because I heard that it was just gorgeous and super enjoyable. On a conceptual level, though, if I am to assume that the Yiddish production just translated the book of the English version into Yiddish rather than like drawing from the original Yiddish source material a little more heavily, my gut instinct is to say that it's putting kind of an interesting band-aid over the situation, because the problems with the transmutation of what was really a very dark story in Tevye the Dairyman, and in fact in Tevye the Dairyman so much happens that doesn't make it into the musical, most notably for me the suicide of one of Tevye's daughters after she has a dalliance with a wealthy man who Tevye introduces her to. Tevye inadvertently ruins his daughter's life to the point that she feels she has no way out but to commit suicide. It's an incredible piece of writing when it happens. It's deeply felt and tragic. And Tevye, for once, is at a loss for words. You know, he always has a Torah quote ready for every situation. It's always like midrash this, midrash that, to the point that nobody really wants to listen to him talk anymore. And I have a hard time imagining that spirit being carried into the musical, even if they do restore the musical to what should have been its original language. That said, I've heard nothing but good things about the Yiddish production. I hope that it comes back in the after times so that I get a chance to see it. I think that the musicality of Yiddish is just so beautiful and unique. And I also think that it's a special thing to write a musical in Yiddish post-Holocaust, because of course, as we all know, the Holocaust decimated the population of Yiddish speakers to the point that there were almost none left. So you're doing a very different thing when you produce a musical in Yiddish in 2021 than when you produce a musical in Yiddish in like 1904 or whatever, if there even were really musicals at the time. Like if you had made Fiddler on the Roof a vaudeville at that time, it would have read very differently than it does in a post-Holocaust world. And so I think that there's a lot that's good to be said for that. but I'm not convinced that that's a solution to the liberalization of Tevye the character through the musical.
If I could also just add something really quick, because you really just triggered something in my mind. I just remembered that my Yiddish acting teacher, Alan Lewis Rickman of Adam Sandler's The Cobbler fame, he might be the only person I know to be very critical of the musical. He told our class that it's the first ever production of Fiddler on the Roof to be produced completely in gibberish, because most of the actors did not speak Yiddish and or weren't even like learning Yiddish. They were just learning these specific lines. There was like a conscious decision to not focus on finding native Yiddish speaking actors, but rather finding people who might fit the aesthetic of the role more. And so by his opinion, with the exception of maybe the song, the lines are just garbage. Like, so I find that fascinating, like when discussing the fact that it's supposed to create this authenticity.
Yeah, I mean, again, not having seen the musical, now that I hear that, my instinct is to be much more critical of it, because there are Yiddish speaking actors. There are
In
countless
New York?
of the Sids. Yeah, New York, that casting call would have taken like 20 minutes to fill. And the fact that there was no effort made to fill it really does point to a shallowness in, like, you know, someone woke up one morning and was like, what if Fiddler on the Roof, but in Yiddish this time? And like, that was as far as the planning needed to go. And the idea that actors who don't speak Yiddish, you know, all they have to do is memorize some transliterated lines, I don't care for that. I think that that does a real disservice to what could have been something really unique and beautiful, I think. So yeah, don't like that shit at all. I don't like that idea.
Awesome. I have a question from Jen, and this is for everybody on the panel, especially. Whenever I lean into Jewishness in writing, I can almost feel the eye rolls. Do any of you get this feeling at all? Are you wanting to write into your Jewishness in your poetry in writing, or be a little wary, especially if you're white and Jewish? So yeah, I think, you know, yeah, and this is for everybody on the panel. Yeah, I can feel the eye roll. Sometimes I'm like, I don't want to be like too obvious, you know, I'm like, Jew pain, you know, oh God. And I'm sure, yeah, everybody on this panel can agree where it's just like trying to mine out the trauma to get, you know, hopefully a publication, like, oh, this is so painful. But at the same time, like also just, that's actually going to be my rap name, Jew Pain, 2 Chain. But yeah, so I think, yeah, Jesse, Kenny, you want to jump in on here?
Well, I was just gonna say that occasionally I will throw in you know, like whatever words or ideas I was raised with, you know. And I mean, I have some Jewish friends around here in Albany, but not many, so you know, I don't really discuss a lot of things. But a lot of times I don't necessarily go too deep into anything, thinking of how often it comes up with mixed people about playing up certain things, you know. And Tiffany Hash has talked a lot about being a Black Jew and how people have treated her as, you know, not necessarily being Jewish enough kind of thing. So I tend to be careful about it, and I tend to leave a lot of that for people who know more, want to say more. And that's I think that's the best thing I can do is, and that's why I brought you guys here, is like, here I'll create a stage and a place for people to have these discussions. But I tend not to do that much of it, but occasionally I will sprinkle in like some English, or just some mention of a holiday or something of that nature, you know. But I try not to go too far into like, well, I specifically don't do Holocaust writing, like I don't do slavery writing. You know, I have real issues around that, but that's almost a discussion for me to get into as a Afro-pessimist, Afro-absurdist, Black nihilist stuff. And I take some of that over with dealing with Latinx writing and Jewish writing too. So I'll just leave that at that.
Yeah, I think for myself, I haven't until recently, written about the Jewish experience, I would say. I would maybe, again, allow some of those elements I was talking about to inform my poetics, but I wouldn't necessarily name it. But I think that that's just sort of my style in general with poetry, is that I don't, like I said, I would rather write in a sort of code or make it more of a mystic abstraction of some kind. More so, I think, to avoid the whole Jew pain thing. And maybe there is some, you know, weird internalized shame that we have, that we like can't be too Jewy, or we can't be too loud or about it, or, you know, getting attention for it. Maybe even some of what I was talking about with the complexity of experiencing white privilege, but anti-Semitism at the same time. It's like sometimes we don't feel like we could talk about oppression maybe in similar ways, because we do experience privilege in ways that many other groups don't. Recently I've been trying to write more specifically about my Jewish experience, about my family's history, and even the Holocaust. But I tend to, most writing I've read about the Holocaust is very straightforward, and it kind of seems like cyclical. And I've been trying to write about it in ways with someone reading it that would maybe not have any idea that it's about the Holocaust. You know, and that just might be a preference for finding nuance within it that hasn't become cliche, I guess.
One thing real quick, I do like when Mark Maron talks about how sometimes you just have to remind people that you're Jewish and mention that, you know. And I think that sometimes I think, like with our writing, maybe it's not specifically Jew pain or whatever like that, but just a you know, a little reminder. Just tuck it in there.
Yeah, I think it's really poignant. Oh, sorry, Rex. Poignant to do that, because again, when we were talking about who gets to write Jewish pain, a lot of times when writers do take like the Holocaust and make like the whole inspirational torture porn sort of thing, it's like, I think we do kind of have that internalized shame in some way, but at the same time, we have to take that back, you know, no matter if you're, you know, a Jew who's white or trans or queer or not white, you know, Jew of color, like we have to create those spaces for ourselves, so that way the audience, whether it's, you know, your friends or like a literary audience, can understand that, so they don't think that Judaism, that Jewish culture is this monolith. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I guess all I have to add would be that to my own poetry, it's been really helpful in terms of walking away from that torture porn instinct to understand anti-Semitism less as there are people out there who despise Jews as human beings, and more as what my friend John Gans describes as this obsessive terror of an alien force in the culture, which is historically how anti-Semitism has borne out. You know, all this talk about Jews as rootless cosmopolitans, and, you know, we show up in a city and take over and run everything secretly from the inside. That's not about Jews as people. That's about fear of an alien force. And to my mind, that allows for a Jewish poetic voice that, right, yeah, the space lasers, Jesus, God. My display name on Twitter for a while was Jewish Space Laser Wolf. So there's that. But yeah, to my mind, the Jewish poetic voice, like when I am the subject of a poem and I speak about the Jew pain, it's not so much about my personal Jew pain. It's tapping into a culture that has been persecuted as less than human. And it's trying to speak not just as myself into my own navel, but to an experience that is shared by people for whom that sort of poetry might be really important, right? I think that you can't worry so much about the cringe factor and keep yourself sane and healthy as a writer. You want to worry about the health of your community and how the work you're doing can benefit it, and how, you know, my community happens to be this community of alien invaders, right? According to the anti-Semitic perspective. And so how can I write poetry or anything that helps to heal the wounds that community has suffered, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Like, I think that was maybe some of what I was sort of thinking about is this alien other. And I think that for me, in what interests me, is to talk about that experience more so than maybe the pain or maybe exactly what happened. It's kind of like, you know, in Lost Highway, that, like, there's like a line that's like, I like to remember things, you know, how I remember them, not how they happened. And it's like, it's that kind of, I think in terms of helping the community, maybe is what is necessary right now, because there is so much divisiveness that I think has caused a lot of people to look at each other as like alien life forms. And I think that that's where some really interesting questions come in. And maybe that's why I was also talking about representation or beauty, or what is that? Like, why are we alien for whatever features we have? And I also think that that's where the place of violence starts. So yeah, that's an interesting point. I like how you put that.
And I think that's also why when writers like Sylvia Plath or even Stephen King or non-Jewish writers bring in that other, that's, I think, kind of still is like a dagger, you know, it's just like this other, you know, thing. So absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Hannah and I are kind of going off about this, like we were having like our whole panel the other night about Sylvia Plath, but I, you know, I think I absolutely agree that when you're going to take something like the Holocaust and use it to describe some other uncomfortable experience, that can be really, yeah, you can't just throw the word Holocaust around to talk about a bad day or something, or like someone being mean to you. But I do think that Sylvia Plath's poems, where she does mention the Holocaust, are done really well, and they are really interesting. And I think, you know, she was close enough to it time-wise that I think it wasn't just Jews who experienced the Holocaust. And I think for me, that I like to read other people's points of view on it, because first of all, their responsibility in letting it happen. And I think that it is an issue that wasn't just affecting Jews, that affected the whole world and still does. But my friend the other day, I don't know if he's in here, Michael Sakema, I don't know. Are you still in here? He's on here, but he's muted. He was talking about, you know, we're basically archaeologists studying something like, you know, like it's on a cave wall. And I kind of like view what she was doing in that way. I think that other people, it's hard because, again, it's not, this is not a blanket statement. I think it depends on the person, and it depends on the work and how they approach it. But I think at times it does allow for other groups to develop empathy when maybe they stood by and let these things happen without, you know, later really deeply investigating them.
Yeah, I mean, I still like Sylvia Plath, but, you know, I do think, you know, those poems, again, I do like them, but you do have to kind of take it with this, not grain of salt, but
definitely there's a lot of complexity, I think, looking at it from like both of those.
And that could be a whole other panel, just like how to not write, you know, yeah, the Jewish other as this sort of like meaning for this other uncomfortable topic. So
yeah,
that was a great question.
Sorry, if I could just add one thing to the tail end of that. Something that's always struck me is people never want to appropriate, you know, mundane or pleasant aspects of the Jewish experience. And I think that goes a long way towards an understanding of why, even though I love Sylvia Plath myself, I too am one sad bitch, but at the same time, it leaves me pretty cold that she would take all of this imagery specifically from the Holocaust, because, you know, like any Jew, I'm always stoked to share the odds and ends of my religion and even the secular aspects of my Jewish experience. I love sharing that stuff with other people, but that's not the stuff they're interested in. The stuff they're interested in is the pain. And that leaves me feeling pretty sour a lot of the time, if I'm honest. And that's what sours me on those aspects of Sylvia Plath's poetry. It's never about the Jewish experience.
Yeah.
It's always about the pain.
And that, I think that absolutely can be applied to any minority group. It's the same thing with people wanting to appropriate, Black culture or Asian culture or any, these negative things that are seen as this sort of like a mark of struggle, especially when evangelical Christians try to like make themselves a minority group. And I'm just like, really? Like, you don't want the IBS of Jews? You don't want the, you don't want to argue about like Arnold Palmer's, like, but yeah, absolutely. I think it's this weird wanting to always take this oppression, but like never actually understand or want the joy of it, who like no one ever asked for a babka recipe. They only just want to be like, what's it like in Passover? Like, why do you eat that giant cracker?
One of the, to add to that though, one of the problems is that this pain becomes a joy for somebody else.
Yeah.
And that I've had a lot of issues. I've talked about this on numerous panels and at numerous readings about how sometimes joy can be as big of a problem as pain, because sometimes people will shift pain into joy, like sometimes people like think about it. It's funny to be kind of goth and emo and stuff like that for a lot of people, but yet they take some people appropriate even bigger pains like Holocaust, like slavery, and whatever, wars and things like that. And they shift it into being these things that they think that they can enjoy to a certain extent with people who went through it, or at least through their families went through it, kind of thing, and I have a lot of issues with how that's done, so anyway, yeah, I'm not going to get.
I think that's really valid and like applicable to what we're seeing now. Like that just makes me think of a shit ton of white people who post about police shootings and do nothing else other than that. Like it's like, let me take the suffering of these oppressive groups and look at this performative nature of me posting a black square today. Like that, to me, it's a similar thing. Yeah, right? Like it's like, there is some, it's like getting off on the suffering, which is where it turns to joy for a lot of people. And I see that so much right now. And I think it is a big problem. I don't think if people are using suffering right now, which is monumental in like a lot of proactive ways. I mean, some people are, I don't want to say that nobody is, or that nobody's, doing really important activism, but I do think that this is a similar issue.
And well, to add to that really, really quickly too, is because I started off with science fiction, is that a lot of times what people will do is, I'm not talking about the Holocaust per se, but shift it into some other like metaphors and things like that. And that can also be extremely problematic. Also, yes, I do know that Jews are very much a big part of the civil rights movement in the 60s. Actually, I was going to kind of bring that up earlier, including Bernie Sanders too, but it was good to see that at the bottom of the screen, there in the chat. But yeah, that's a big issue, is how people shift it and say, I'm not talking about this, but it's like, we know you are.
Or applying Hitler to everything constantly.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
We're just kind of like, throwing it around so casually for every bad thing that happens, or for everyone who's slightly an asshole.
Yeah, or the Nazi, like, my last job, the VP of my department was like, oh, I'm such a grammar Nazi about these things. And you do realize I'm Jewish, right? Like, it's just these simple, I think we're always, suit Nazi. Yeah.
Ooh, that's a whole panel, right?
Can I not claim, can we claim George Costanza?
Okay, George Costanza should have been Jewish. Also, at least 2 of the 4 Golden Girls should have been Jewish, and it is so whack that none of them were. That's a panel unto itself.
Mrs. Maisel is like, her actor is not Jewish.
It's just de-Jewification of all these people on TV who are so obviously Jewish. Nobody in the world is more Jewish than George Costanza. I'm sorry.
Yeah, 100%.
It's the damn Italians. They are taking their identity.
It's anti-Italianism also.
I was just listening to something about that, about George Costanza, and they had to make that deal with NBC, like, all right, it won't be that Jewish. And I've said a million times, that a lot of people who don't like Seinfeld, and there are issues with the show, but a lot of people who don't like it, there's a lot of anti-Semitism around people not liking that show.
Yeah, you can take issue with Jerry Seinfeld dating, a 17-year-old, because I do.
Yeah.
Like, I just, yeah. Yikes on spikes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the talking about, the actors that are Jewish or aren't Jewish, like Miss Maisel and stuff, that also, I think, also has a lot to do with what I was talking, which does get me like really heated about like representation and like Jews being behind the camera, in the industry, but not in front of it. And Sarah Silverman went on a really great rant about this recently on her Instagram. She has really funny, like, just, I guess, clips from when she records her podcast. But she was talking about, God, like, give like the one role that comes around every 15 years to the actual Jewish person. And she was talking about, I didn't even see it because I wasn't totally into it, but like the Jojo Rabbit movie. And she was like, even the Jew in the wall wasn't really played by a Jew. Come on, it's the Jew in the wall. So
I think
really
Taika Waititi, I think there's definitely flaws with Jojo Rabbit, but I do think he actually kind of carried that Mel Brooks spirit, into that movie. But I do agree it's this weird divisiveness between Jewish actors, Jewish writers who are Jewish, but they don't ever really express it. Again, when learning about like Marcel Proust or like, these things, by and large, American Jews wanted to be white and not make noise. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's like when you take a show like Mrs. Maisel, but like you don't even understand like culturally different types of Jews, Eastern European Jews, like Tony Shalhoub plays, again, why can't he be ours? But like he looks Jewish. But when you think about like culture, like, okay, Hungarian Jews are different from Russian Jews or like, Polish Jews. But when you just put Jew during that time period of like the 50s, it just doesn't make sense for some of the cultural misses. You know what I mean? Yeah, like it's just kind of becomes this mishmash. And I think even Jews who are working behind the camera who write these things, there's not always an easy way to translate that to a wider audience.
Yeah, I mean, Oh, go ahead. I think someone else was going. Go ahead.
And what's interesting though is that Jews understand that about Jews, right? Is that there's so many different kinds. Like Grace Paley in her stories a couple times mentions the different shades and different approaches to Judaism, and it's rarely discussed. The another thing is in the book Jews Don't Count, which Laura Eve Engel had just recommended. There's a whole thing in that book about Jewish actors not playing Jews, and I thought that was a very interesting. And no one really talks about the same way they would, if a straight person plays a queer person, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I studied theater in New York, and it was just part of why, and it's really, really sad to me, to be honest with you, that I kind of dropped out. That was something that I always loved. I'm very theatrical. I'm a Leo from Long Island. But part of why I stepped back was it became very clear to me, like, these are the opportunities that would be available to me. This is the way that I look, and this is what people see. They either see me being some like sexualized villain, which like could be fun occasionally, but or the best friend. Like I was very rarely ever, even when like, the casting directors would come in and we'd work with it. It was just, I realized very quickly, like, this is how I'm seen. And I didn't like that. And I didn't want my own storytelling to be limited to that. But yeah, Jen in the chat said, God forbid there's a Sephardic Jew. I mean, honestly, if you could even name 5 Sephardic or Mediterranean or, Jews with dark coloring, other than like, I guess Gal Gadot, who's like a 10-foot tall supermodel, so she doesn't count. But like, like, have you ever seen anybody of that in a leading role? There's the one girl from Glee. She's literally like Sephardic. Actually, it's weird. My grandmother and like her family have like the last same name, so we might be related. But there's like one that I could think of like ever that I've seen in my lifetime. So that's really, I think, a hard thing to say. well, why isn't anybody like me able to tell a story?
Yeah, it's always hard, I think, when we talk about like identity, Jewish identity, because again, you know, there is unfortunately part like Jews who are very bigoted. My uncle was like raised Reform, but went like totally bonkers into like Orthodox, like straight up lives in Israel, Zionist territory, like, you know, kind of that area. And, you know, you have like who gets to claim to be a Jew and who isn't, but then you kind of come across that problem again when someone is writing from a very minority within a minority experience. And it's like, where do you see yourself? How can you express yourself as a, you know, Jewish writer when you already have these other things that put a target on your back? And then you see people like, again, just not fully understanding. And again, coming from a white, like, I guess Ashkenazi-ish, you know, background, I'm always trying to learn more about, you know, things like Ladino, like, yeah, that language, and, you know, different types of ways that other Jews like communicate with each other. So it is like kind of a lifelong practice. And that's why I think it's a problem when you don't see that sort of representation, when other writers and poets take these sort of, again, like one landmark of Jewish culture and just turn it into their own pain. That's, I think, where some things get misfired, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah.
The Romanite community that I was talking about, my grandfather's ancestors and his family, they spoke Ladino in that. So it's interesting to learn about because it's a combination of so many different things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there were other mishmash, I don't want to say mishmash, but like other mishmash of like, you know, languages with Jews, like with Hebrew and just like everything that kind of melts into it.
Yeah, especially just because of the displacement, and it was constant, you know, I mean, the reason that it is so mishmashed is because it was like constantly being kicked out of one place to another. So you have Spanish speaking Jews and part of my family, then like people who spoke with the Ladino accent, they were in France and they were in Italy. I mean, I literally tried looking on Ancestry and it was just like, okay, so all of Europe, okay.
Right.
I wanted to ask an obnoxious non-question. I wanted to, hi Jesse. Hi everyone, it's good to see all of you. It's great to listen to everyone's little bits. I am wondering if anyone would like to speak kind of more, my question is more broad in speaking toward like intellectualism and Jewish literature, the Jewish writing community. This is something I think about a lot and kind of feel, at least in my experience as a Jewish person, is kind of like a defining trait of Jewishness, is like this sort of constant pursuit of intellectualism and knowledge, and just wondering if anyone has thoughts they'd like to chat toward on that.
Well, I'll go there. You know, as I said before, you know, like maybe instead of the people of the book, people of the books kind of thing. And I found it very interesting because I didn't want to come in here today and just do Proust for 10 minutes, which initially that's really how I pitched this. Is like, who wants to do something around me and I'll just do Proust. But anyway, so I found that a lot of Jewish writers who don't think of themselves as being necessarily very Jewish oftentimes will try to dig themselves into books and into whatever kind of Jewish cultures they can get out of these books sometimes to say, I belong here. And this is something we've been doing for a long time. Now, what I will say to that is, you know, and there's a lot of Jewish philosophers who we didn't even know were Jewish for a while. Wittgenstein, almost no one talks about it. You know, why are we taught Levinas? Why, like, Kierkegaard's this, and Buber's like, we don't fucking talk about Buber. And he's misunderstood. I love Martin Buber's my homeboy now. I love Martin Buber. But anyway, so I think that intellectualism can be a very big and important part of Jewishness. One thing that I think is also very important for us coming in here, and I didn't really talk about him, but I'm going to talk about him now, which is when we move over to the artistic movements, and we talk about somebody like Saul LeWitt, he really wants to push away from that a bit and decide that he can deal with just ideas and a lot of his ideas. Yes, he has a love for Beckett and gets some of his ideas from Beckett. He says that he likes these philosophical realist writers, which I like. But he also wants to push away from some sort of logic and rationalism. And when he speaks of mysticism, he may actually be speaking mysticism, but I think he's also speaking of how intuition and things like that work when we talk about somebody like, what you call it, Henri Bergson. And I always talk about there's the circle, there's a spiral, and then there's like a coil, you know, and I think that's what he's getting at. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. My point is that as much as intellectualism can be a part of what it means to be a Jewish person, we also need to allow ourselves the moment to walk away from that and to allow ourselves to dig into our own selves and to say, it just happened. You know, I didn't want to talk about Ginsberg, but first thought, best thought, every once in a while, I'm like, okay, I'll let it happen. I tend to say nagging thought, best thought, but first thought, best thought works sometimes.
And I do wonder about like the intersections of like intellectualism and trauma, right? Like within the Jewish community. Because
oh my God, Lily, you just read my mind, of course.
Yeah, I mean, Jesse, I know you would probably love to speak to that, but like, yeah, that to me, that feels super prominent. And, you know, as like a therapist in training, I couldn't agree more with the sentiment of like walking away when we need to and feeling and just like finding these other ways of knowing or exploring or feeling. So anyway, yeah, glad that we had similar minds on that.
Of
Jessica.
course. Well, I think in general, we see a lot of what we're doing in our work and what, you know, we have a lot of parallels. But I think, well, I agree with what Kenny was saying, first of all, about, you know, we need to sometimes walk away and trust intuition. I think that that's definitely what I try to do with my work and then defy logic. But I think when you have the kind of history that Jews have and the trauma that they have in their bodies and in their histories, it's, you know, it leaves people wanting to understand ultimately. I mean, I think it's pretty simple. People, how can you sit with that knowledge and not question everything about this world? And I sort of view it that way of, I think people who have really significant traumas are just really drawn to wanting to know and wanting to understand and wanting to make sense of things. And I think that for me is like how I see a lot of like intellectual pursuits with Jews, just trying to understand as much as they possibly can. It's kind of like therapists who, you know, who come from trauma and then become therapists because like they want to understand and maybe even be in control of it a little bit.
Sorry, Jesse, I didn't mean to interrupt. I would agree with what you're saying, and also I'd want to point out that sort of compulsive need to understand and to question, it's both influenced by just the sheer number of traumas that Jews have as a people have had to endure, but it's also baked into the religion itself, like right into the schema of our religious practice. I mean, every week there's Parsha to study with great dedication and to unpack. And I was speaking earlier about the Jewish mandate for literacy, and not just literacy like, you know, learning a couple words here and there that are relevant to your trade or whatever so that you can have contracts, any stuff like that. Literacy that allows you to dig into an important text and make sense of it. It's an active literacy that isn't mandated everywhere. It's a Jewish mandate specifically. And so I think that the two feed off each other. You know, we suffer and we intellectualize that suffering, and we also intellectualize because we see it as our mandate from God.
And that's really interesting to me as a Jew who was almost completely a cultural Jew. Like I had no religious background whatsoever. My mom is Jewish, but was raised just culturally Jewish and went to Unitarian Church. So, and I kind of got a sense of that, Rax, in listening to you talk about Tevye and like the mandate for literacy, right? And like why it makes sense that Tevye was literate. But yeah, to kind of understand it also is sort of baked into Jewish religious practices, like that makes a lot of sense.
I think we have a little bit more time. Does anybody else have any other quick questions or, anything? Because, we could talk about this all day, and there's so many other panel ideas that could come from our conversations. So.
Okay, then I'm just gonna kind of let us go on this note. So I'm glad we all got together and discussed this. We all know that even though we got a new president, that a lot of shit's not fucking changing. I'd like to bring us back to the fact that one of the great anarchists, Emma Goldman, was a Jewish person, put a lot of fucking shit out there. Also a Cancer, so even better. But I just want to really put that out there and to say that there are. I read quite a few stories to get ready for this, and there were several times where one of the codes for somebody being Jewish was they look like a communist. And that's something else I just really want to bring up, that when we discuss the transgressive nature of Jewish poetics, is that there are a lot of really political things that we've done, will continue to do, and need to keep doing, because shit's not going to get better overnight, so we can't stop. That's all I have to say. And thank you to everybody. Everybody did a really good job.
Yeah, this is I think a wonderful panel and conversation. We all brought something to the to the oneg, so to speak. And I'm learning new things. Literally, I think in the chat, like about the Bollywood Jewish, and like that to me, like again, talking about my own experience as a white Jewish American person. I had no idea. And I think it's important to keep learning, because we aren't all arbiters of Jewish culture, but we each can contribute. And that's why we have to just keep, contributing to that. So that way we don't let Goyim like Stephen King or Sylvia Plath take it, or, let other questionable Jews like Ben Shapiro kind of be, or, God, yeah. Ugh. It's like when I learned that Mara Wilson's his cousin, I'm like, whoa, everybody has one in their family. Wow. But yeah, thank y'all so much for attending, and this was excellent. I'm so happy to be among, obviously the chosen people, but just like these people in general, and that you chose to attend this panel.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.